but I feel like the Jubilee is one of the most central messages of Jesus's gospel and ministry, and completely unknown. And even when you explain it to people, they nod, and then they don't remember the word Jubilee. They remember everything it means: the unleashing of God's mercy, confession, the forgiveness of debts, the redistribution of land, our spiritual land, right? So how do we make the word Jubilee stick? How do we make it really enter into our vocabulary and into our kind of head and our heart?
Well, I don't know. Maybe you have some ideas about some catchy phrase that would, foot the bill. Another biblical term is the year of the Lord's favor, and we use that as a subtitle. But this is an interesting thing. We have a crazy coincidence, Michael, that the Latin word jubilatio and its relatives, which refers to rejoicing, just happens to resemble the Hebrew word yobel, which actually refers to a ram's horn that was used to blow and as a signal, as a warning. And so the actual year of Jubilee goes back to the Hebrew, not to the Latin. It was not a year of celebration. It was a year of the blowing of the ram's horn. And that was because that was the signature act of the year. After the Day of Atonement ceremony was over, after the high priest had gone into the most sacred part of the sanctuary and atoned for the sins of the entire nation before the living, true, and creator God, he would come out of the sanctuary, bless the people, and then they would blow the horn of freedom throughout the land. And we actually have this inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. There's a line from Leviticus 25 to proclaim liberty throughout the land. And that's what's inscribed there. As part of our heritage as Americans, we picked up these biblical themes of liberation, which inspired our founding fathers. But it was the blowing of the horn, and not to just, announce a year of celebration and carousing, but of forgiveness of debt, of the release of lands that had been sold away from the family. So everybody's family's homestead came back to them. And those who, not really slaves, I don't want to get into the tall weeds of this discussion, but kind of indentured servants. In Israel, you could not truly be a slave in ancient Israel, but you could sell your labor to pay off debt. And all such people were freed by the blowing of this horn. And so it was a big reset, pressing the big red button on the economy and on society to restore everything to factory settings. And factory settings, of course, were the freedom, the familial love, and the abundance of God, the fullness of God, I call it, that was experienced by our first parents in the Garden of Eden, in kind of that ideal state when they were at peace with God and at peace with nature. And maybe could not perfectly be attained again, but this cyclical every 50-year celebration of the Yovel, or the Jubilee, was meant to bring God's people back to what we might call an Edenic state, or the state of Adam and Eve.
Yeah, I loved that your first chapter is on Eden. So if we want to think about the Jubilee year, this every 50 years, this restoration of land and liberty, forgiveness of debts, we don't want to look to the future in terms of an earthly political kingdom, right? This is exactly what will not happen at the earthly political level. It actually would be a false Messiah, a false Christ, an antichrist who would promise it, because the genuine Jubilee, as you mentioned, follows upon the Day of Atonement. It follows upon the cleansing of Israel's sin. So just say a little bit more about how this both is, or both it was a real part of the old law, meant to be, actually implemented and practiced at some level, and yet clearly at the same time kind of a reality that could only be manifested and completed beyond the geopolitical level.
Certainly. I mean, and I point this out in the book as well as in my scholarly work on the Jubilee, is that at the heart of the Jubilee was the Day of Atonement. It was reconciliation between God and man, especially between God and his people, and the forgiveness of the debt of their sin. And then one of the central meanings of the Jubilee was that this reconciliation between God and his people was meant then to be expressed between what we might call the sibling relationships of God's children among each other. Very, very much like the parable that our Lord tells in Matthew 18 of the unforgiving servant who's forgiven, probably $1 trillion in modern day equivalent by the king, but then goes out and will not forgive his fellow servant who owes him maybe a few $1,000s. So that's a kind of a negative example, but what should have happened in that instance, of course, is that receive the forgiveness of the king and then go forgive your fellow man, your fellow sister, etc. And so that was the meaning of the Jubilee, was that the forgiveness that we have received from God needs to be expressed in concrete ways towards our brothers and sisters who are also part of the people of God. And what I found in my working on the scholarship on the Jubilee over the decades, Michael, was that many ideologically driven scholars, usually towards what, for lack of a better term, we sometimes call the political left, of course, would want to hijack the Jubilee for its socio-political sense or inspiration, but just bypass the whole transcendent or spiritual dimension, that it was really grounded in reconciliation with God first. And of course, none of those visions ever works out. And this even brings up, our beloved new Pope, Pope Leo, and then his predecessor, Leo XIII, who wrote about this in his encyclical Rerum Novarum on the social teaching of the church, who criticized various, socialist movements that wanted to deny the spiritual dimension of man and jump right to some kind of utopian political solution. And that never works. Okay, the true reconciliation of human beings with one another is going to happen through the Catholic Church. I mean, the Catholic Church is the OG United Nations. Okay, the United Nations is just a fake. It's like Diet Coke. It's like it's an imitation of the real thing, without the pizzazz that makes the real thing so good. The Catholic Church is really given to the nations to reconcile. The Catholic Church, in a very real way, is the realization of Jubilee, the way that we commune with one another in both spiritual and material goods. This is the kind of equality and restoration that was envisioned by the ancient prophets as well as our Lord. And you see the early church in the book of Acts, for example, living a common life, caring for even their mutual material needs and having their goods in common. Now, complete commonality of goods really only works like in ecclesiolae, in little churches within the church, like religious orders, because it can only really work on a small scale. But even in the church universal, through our sharing in our material goods, we can really manifest the fact that the church is the fulfillment of Jubilee, as in fulfillment of our Lord's, preaching, and the way he's presented, of course, in the Gospels. And maybe we'll get into this, especially the Gospel of Luke. Jesus really comes as the one to proclaim the supernatural Jubilee.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.